All right. If you wonder where books like this come from, I'm here to tell you they come from somebody with a sustained obsession. I, of course, have been obsessed with coal for quite a long time, but I want you to know that I've never lost sight of the fact that to most people, coal is a pretty boring topic. It's a pretty unlikely topic for a book, and I cannot tell you how many conversations I have had that have come to a screeching halt. I get a lot of blank faces and a kind of silence in response, and you know, some people are just incredulous or just not sure they heard it right, so they'll say C-O-A-L. I think the best line was from a man who said, "Coal, would that be porter or slaw?" He actually knew better, but it was still a great line. So I want to assure you that I did not write this book for people with a pre-existing interest in coal, though if you happen to have one, that's great. But I wrote this book for people with no interest in coal, for those people who got that blank look on their face, people who don't think they're interested in coal, but who are interested in the world and in how it got to be the way it is and in what might happen next. And of course, there are a lot of ways you can look at those issues, and a lot of the books in this store do that. But coal, it turns out, is a particularly revealing way to look at it. How did I get interested in coal? I get asked that question a lot. As you heard, I was an assistant attorney general here in Minnesota for a number of years, and I focused on environmental regulation. I helped, among other things, enforce the air quality laws. In the mid-1990s, there was a particular proceeding here in Minnesota, an energy planning proceeding, where we tried to quantify in dollars and cents the environmental cost of generating electricity. We in Minnesota get most of our electricity from coal. That's in fact true of the nation as a whole, and it is why, in fact, modern America burns more coal, much more coal, than at any other point in its history. I thought that this proceeding was going to be a dry, sort of technical and boring affair, and it turned out to, in fact, be a really enormous and extremely contentious proceeding. And the reason that happened is because we didn't just look at acid rain and ozone or the health effects of coal from the kind of traditional pollutants that people are used to worrying about. We looked at climate change. That was a subject that I personally had never spent any time worrying about before, but it was a subject that we couldn't ignore by the mid-1990s, and it was something that struck a very sensitive nerve with the coal industry. Representatives of the coal industry, of course we don't have one in Minnesota, but we buy our coal from out of state, came to Minnesota. They intervened in our proceeding. They ended up helping to make it one of the longest administrative trials in state history. And they brought with them a phalanx of scientific witnesses who testified to us that we don't have to worry about climate change. And it was such a relief to hear this, because they told us that the climate was not going to change, or that if it did change, it was only really going to happen in very small ways that we were going to enjoy. And I have to tell you, there was a part of me that really wanted to believe them, even though my client, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, was taking just the opposite view. And so I, tried to resist the lure of the more comfortable view being put forth by the coal industry. And of course, the easy way to do that was to take a look at the evidence, which already by then was so compelling, much too compelling, to just wish away. I should say that I'm proud of Minnesota's decision makers. They did a very good job of resisting the rosier predictions of the coal industry, accepting instead the much more disturbing projections of the other thousands of mainstream scientists, those scientists that the entire rest of the world is depending on. It's too soon to say really what effect that proceeding had on Minnesota, but it had a really profound effect on me. For the first time, I had really focused on coal in the aggregate, and I was astonished to realize what kind of large effect it was still having on air quality after centuries, it turns out, of effort to try to deal with that, and at the growing effect it was having on the climate, which is a problem we have not even begun to address, at least not in this country. So I decided to do a little research, particularly into the history. And I have to say, it's when I got to the history of this fuel that I got really hooked. And I stopped thinking of that history as just the background to what's going on with coal today. I started realizing that what's happening now is really the very dramatic culmination of a long, centuries-long story. And then I quit my job and put aside my law career to write a book about coal. Now, a word about the title, Coal. It took years. The subtitle is A Human History, and it's not perhaps the most accurate. A more accurate title might have been something like A Natural and Social and Political and Environmental and Cultural History with a discussion of current events and some predictions about the future. That was a little long. I like A Human History for a couple of reasons. One, because it suggests things, it has very large implications, and this is a story with large implications. But also it has implications that are very small and personal. And while I've tried to tell a large story, I've tried to do it through very small, readable vignettes and anecdotes about how this substance has affected people's day-to-day lives now for centuries. I discovered in my research that attitudes about coal have varied tremendously over the centuries and from society to society, which is perhaps not surprising. Some of the first people to really value coal didn't value it because of its heat content. They valued it because of its beauty. I have my lump here. Never leave home without it. In fact, we have records of Neolithic Chinese, thousands of years ago, who found coal, this is actually Chinese coal, but probably not the same they used, who carved coal into what archaeologists have labeled ear-piercing ornaments. So apparently they were wearing coal in their ears. We know that the Romans, when they went to Britain, wrote back to Rome and talked about the best stone in Britain, and it was coal. But the reason they really liked it was because they could carve it into ornaments, and it became something of a fashion trend in Rome to have these shiny black and flammable. After it was prized for its beauty, much later it became basically just the epitome of disappointment. It was what you would find in your Christmas stocking if you had been bad. There were other times in history, in fact, quite a long stretch of history, where coal was perceived as something really quite evil. It smelled, for one thing, of brimstone, which is what we call sulfur. It was mined in these scary subterranean places, and it was widely perceived that those mines were haunted by demons. But later on in history, it came to be seen as really the foundation of civilization itself. It became seen as a gift from God sent to help lift up civilization. There's one quote in particular here that I like, very succinct. This is a writer from the early 20th century who said, "With coal," and he capitalizes coal. This is from a great little book called The Coal Catechism. He said, "With coal, we have light, strength, power, wealth, and civilization. Without coal, we have darkness, weakness, poverty, and barbarism." Another writer put it, used, I think, a little more complicated metaphor, and it was that of the genie to describe coal. And I like that metaphor, and I use it in the book because coal, like a genie, has indeed granted many of our wishes. It has empowered us in tremendous ways. It has made many of us in developed nations wealthy beyond our pre-industrial dreams. But like a genie, it has a dark and unpredictable side, and we have paid throughout history and well into the future a very high price for that power. But I wanted to try to capture in this book both sides of it, both the sort of creative and the destructive side of it, because I think if you miss one of those sides, you're not going to really understand our history, and you're not really going to understand the challenges that we face. Now, here are some of the things that I'd like to cover today. How coal turned Britain into a global superpower, how coal not only fueled the Industrial Revolution, but inspired the creation of the two most revolutionary technologies, the steam engine and the railway, how coal created whole new social classes of people, promoting both the rise of industrial capitalism and the rise of communism, how coal helped tame the American wilderness, win the Civil War, push the frontier westward, how coal set the pattern for concentrated corporate power and public mistrust of that power, how coal shaped the U.S. labor movement, how fighting coal smoke was a major part of the early environmental movement, how coal today is quite probably killing thousands of Americans yearly, how coal is promoting the very dangerous and permanent warming of our climate, how the coal industry is celebrating new political power in America, and how coal use today is revealing geopolitical rifts between America and most of the rest of the world. But of course, I'm not really going to cover any of that because it's way too much and we have only a few minutes. So what I'm going to do instead, and let me say that that is all covered in Coal, A Human History, I write a great deal about Britain because Britain really was the first society, not the first to burn it because that was China, but the first society to be really permanently transformed by coal. Of course, what happened was coal carried Britain over that all-important threshold between the pre-industrial world and the industrial world. The consequences were momentous economically, socially, and environmentally, particularly in places like London. London had long been known for its fogs, including occasional great stinking fogs, as one 17th century astronomer called them in his weather records. There was, though, a marked increase in the frequency of London fogs between 1750 and 1890. Natural climate fluctuations could have contributed to the increase, but inevitably, so did the smoke. The city could barely be seen from above, such as from the top of St. Paul's Cathedral. Lord Byron described the London skyline as a wilderness of steeples peeping on tiptoe through their sea coal canopy. Smoke was such a quintessential part of London that for a long time the city held the nickname the Big Smoke. While the fogs were unnatural, they could also be beautiful. Many residents and visitors looked on the smoke as picturesque, enhancing the mystery and excitement of the city, perhaps one reason why 19th century efforts to clean the city's air were such a failure. British writers called the thick air London's sublime canopy that shrouds the city of the world, and referred to their beloved smoke. Indeed, although some travelers from abroad were appalled by the smoke, many others were charmed by it. A Canadian visitor writing late in the century said that the comforting smoke gave a kind of solidity and nutriment to the air and made you feel as if your lungs digested it. In 1883, an American poet living in London wrote, "Today we are having a yellow fog, and that always enlivens me. It has such a knack of transfiguring things. Even the cabs are rimmed with a halo, and people across the way have all that possibility of suggestion which piques the fancy so in figures of fading frescoes. Even the gray, even the black fogs make a new and unexplored world not unpleasing to one who is getting palled with familiar landscapes." Unquote. For reasons we still don't understand, London's fogs were more frequently being reported as strangely colored, including the occasional orange and dark chocolate fogs. With all its potential for aesthetic appeal, it's quite clear that the pollution of Victorian London could bring confusion and death, particularly when a dense fog planted itself over the city for 3 or more days. On a Wednesday in December 1873, for example, a thick, cold fog settled in and stayed until the following Saturday, at one point stretching 50 miles from the city. Visibility was reduced to a few yards, and according to the brief articles printed in the weather section of the Times, all locomotion, especially to people on foot at the crossings of great thoroughfares, became extremely dangerous. The fog was blamed for a sad and chaotic parade of sometimes fatal accidents that left the hospitals straining to care for the injured. Carriages crashed into light posts and other obstacles. People were run over by omnibuses and hansom cabs. One poor fellow was run over by both. Horses tripped and crushed their riders, and a train struck a man who was putting fog lights along the track. The police were kept busy trying to handle the multitude of lost children. The most common reported fog-related deaths were the 20 drownings that took place over the 4-day period, caused when people simply stumbled into the Thames or the canals of the city, or when barge collisions threw them into the water. the paper failed to report that several cattle in the city for an exhibition dropped dead in the fog, and many others were in such distress that they had to be immediately slaughtered. Amidst the various locomotion-related deaths, the Times also noted the deaths of two gentlemen who had, in separate incidents, fell in the street and shortly died from inhaling the fog. In reporting just these two deaths by inhalation, the Times was off by 2 orders of magnitude. An analysis of the city's death statistics performed decades later showed that the 1873 fog quietly killed from 270 to 700 Londoners. Another foggy week in 1880 would kill from 700 to 1,100 people, and one in 1892 would kill about 1,000. These deaths went largely unreported, while people worried instead about the far less deadly but more dramatic confusion in the streets. 19th century Londoners probably had the statistical skills to detect these deaths long before they actually did, if they had only looked. Perhaps they didn't look because they had been living for so long in a fog of their own making that they simply took it for granted. They stopped asking the harder questions about the impact this unnatural new world they'd created so energetically was having on its human inhabitants. This brashness was just one of the traits that, along with coal, put the British at the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, across the Atlantic, there was another nation that shared all these traits, and it was undergoing an even more astonishing transformation. And of course, that transformation was the change from a heavily forested near wilderness into an industrial superpower, and it was happening very quickly. As early as the late 1700s, people in Philadelphia found the price of firewood going up, and that was because the trees nearby had already been consumed. Industries in Philadelphia actually imported bituminous coal, soft coal, sometimes from as far as Britain, to meet their needs. Now, there's a tremendous irony here because Pennsylvania is loaded with coal, bituminous on the west, and on the east there is a very hard form of coal, clean-burning kind of coal, called anthracite. But that anthracite was trapped up in the mountains, and it was very difficult to get down to the city. Doesn't mean people didn't try, though, and in fact, people in the late 1700s, early 1800s would go up to this anthracite region, cut down some of those trees, and make these long flatboats out of the wood. They called them arcs. And they would load them up with coal, put 4 or 5 people on each one, and send it down the Lehigh River, hoping, several days later, to arrive in Philadelphia. The Lehigh River at the time was quite wild, so in essence, these people were shooting the rapids in their coal boats, trying to get to the market. There were a couple of problems. Most of the ships crashed and sank. That was one problem. The other problem was that the ones that made it through were not wanted. This was hard coal. Some people called it stone coal, and a lot of people really didn't think it could burn because it was much harder to ignite than the kind of bituminous coal they were used to burning. Nobody quite knew what to do with this anthracite coal. In fact, one of the shipments that made it through in 1803, they paved the footwalks with it because they just couldn't quite figure it out. But of course, that was not the end for the would-be U.S. coal industry. There was another effort that I'd like to read about. Despite this failure, in a few years, there would be another bold effort to bring Summit Hill coal, that's the anthracite, down to the city. This one to relieve a shortage of imported bituminous caused by the War of 1812. To seize the opportunity presented by the war, a well-educated and connected man named Jacob Sist leased the Summit Hill mine with some partners. Instead of hiring farmers near the mine, Sist chose to bring in a labor force from his home of Wilkes Barre, a town well north of the mine. He gathered a small but enthusiastic army, mainly composed of boys from the area's most prominent families. And in July 1814, they marched off as if to war, amidst much fanfare and singing. They had no experience in coal mining, ark building, or rapids running. But they did include a good Latin scholar, a natural-born poet, and one young man principally noted for his musical powers. One of this workforce would later say of Sist and his partners, "The whole thing was a romance. Here was a chance for adventure well suited to their prolific imaginations, beside an eternity of glorious posthumous fame. In August, they managed to send 4 arcs loaded with coal down the Lehigh. 3 of them sank. When a rock ledge tore a hole in the bottom of the 4th, it looked as if the end was near, but its crew of 6 quickly stripped off their clothes, stuffed them in the hole, and kept the ark afloat. These gentlemen of Wilkes Barre arrived in Philadelphia several days later, nearly naked, bruised, blackened with coal dust, and glad to be alive, according to Sist, who was among them. Now, Sist and his partners never really were able to make anything out of that coal mine. It went under. They had to sell it after the war. But they did get a little bit of the fame they sought because they sold that heroically delivered shipment of coal to a couple of industrialists in Philadelphia who went on then to invest in the area and to really kind of open it up by taming the Lehigh River and then going in and bringing in canals and railroads. The region itself went on to become the site of the nation's first major land rush, its first major canal and railroad systems, its first major corporate cartel, and some of the bloodiest labor relations in U.S. history. This is the area where the famous Molly Maguires once worked. The Molly Maguires were allegedly a secret society of Irish Catholic coal mining terrorists. And this is where the prosecution that was essentially controlled, in fact, consisted of the railroads that controlled the area, tried the Molly Maguires and had them hanged. By 1900, America became the world's top producer of coal, drawing on coal from lots of different states, and of course, it became an industrial powerhouse as a result. I also have a chapter in the book about China. China turns out to be incredibly important to this story for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it has the oldest history of coal mining, and coal pops up at all kinds of amazing places in China's amazing history. It is also, of all the major nations right now, the one that is by far the most dependent on coal. They have lots of coal, they have lots of people, and they have a very fast-growing economy, and they're counting on their coal to help them bring electricity to the hundreds of millions of people there who either don't have it or don't have very much of it. Another thing that makes China important is that when the Bush administration talks about why America is not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol, which is the treaty to reduce greenhouse gases, one of the common reasons is because it wouldn't be fair for America to have to reduce its greenhouse gases when countries, developing countries, and particularly like China, don't have to reduce theirs. And in fact, that puts America and China in a very strange little club together. These two countries burn more coal than anyone else in the world. In fact, about the same amount, depending on whose numbers you believe, not on a per capita basis, but on an absolute basis. And both countries reserve the right to burn a lot more and plan to do so. So I went to China to research the book, and that's where my next excerpt is. If you get on a train in Beijing and travel a couple of days west through the mountains and toward the center of the vast Asian landmass, you will find yourself in Inner Mongolia's forbidding Ordos Desert. I made this journey not long ago. As I looked out the train window, I was struck by the emptiness of the land, a reminder of how far I was from the crowded bustle of coastal China. There was the occasional lone herdsman guiding a few forlorn-looking sheep. It was a mystery to me how the few tufts of grass and brush clinging to the yellow sand and rocky hills could yield enough energy to support any animals at all. Here and there, the smokestacks of isolated factories rose up out of the desert, but it was no mystery where they got their energy. It was from the jungles that once grew here, and that bequeathed to China coal deposits richer than those of any other nation except the United States. I was traveling with a young English-speaking Chinese woman from Beijing, whom I will call Jane. Not only did Jane prove to be a highly capable guide and translator, but she had a charm that could get us into places I could have never otherwise seen, and when needed, get us out again. One such place was a coal-burning power plant outside a small city in the Ordos. This plant used the same basic generating technology as the Sherco plant in Minnesota, a few miles north of here, and was about the same age, but it was far smaller and already slightly bedraggled. A window had been broken and left unfixed. So many interior lights had burned out that it was hard to see the electric generator. I saw more people at this small plant than at the much larger American one, but none appeared to be working at the time. Rather, they gathered in groups of 4 and 5 to watch me, smiling and occasionally shouting out an English hello. They laughed heartily when I tried to respond in Chinese. Jane explained that although 2 Western men had visited the city years before, I was the first Western woman most of these people had ever seen in person. Remote as it is, this corner of Inner Mongolia, like the rest of China, is ready for the outside world to discover it. The city's top hotel may have hot water for only 1 hour a day by prearrangement so they can crank up the coal-fired boiler. But behind the front desk, a bank of clocks helpfully gives the time in major foreign cities such as London and New York. The power plant official who showed us around had been told only that I was an American tourist with an unusual fascination for coal. I wondered why he even let us in, but then it became awkwardly clear that he believed I represented foreign investors who might be willing to pump some much-needed capital into his facility. As we left this plant, our taxi driver said he had a friend at another power plant we could visit a few miles away. When we arrived, our driver boldly led us through the gates and onto the grounds. Before we could find our driver's friend, we heard shouting. A man of evident authority ran up and began yelling at me in Chinese. As I looked around nervously, imagining our imminent arrest, Jane smiled and reassured him with some friendly banter that I was harmless, and he calmed down. We left quickly. Jane told me later that the man had accused me of being there to document pollution to embarrass China for political reasons. It would have been far harder to explain to him the more complicated truth. The very different reactions to my presence at these 2 power plants reflect the conflicting feelings the Chinese have toward the outside world. Years of isolation and the economic disasters of decades past have brought a genuine eagerness to connect with other nations, along with a strong reluctance to be judged by their standards, especially environmental standards that rich nations did not embrace until they were rich. These are sentiments best understood in the larger context of China's ancient glories, its humiliation at the hands of the West, and its desperate 20th century attempts to modernize aspects of Chinese history that prominently feature coal. And that's what else I write about in that chapter. Finally, I would like to talk a little more about climate change and why it's so important to the story of coal and to the story of everything else. Coal is mostly carbon. And when you burn that carbon, it turns into carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, which is building up in our atmosphere and which is going to be lingering now for centuries, trapping heat on Earth. Now, you also get carbon dioxide when you burn petroleum, which is a very big problem, and when you burn natural gas, which is a smaller problem. But coal, because it has so much carbon, gives you by far the most carbon dioxide for the amount of energy you get out of it. So that's what makes it the most climate unfriendly of all the fossil fuels. And that's why the coal industry is very concerned about climate change policies and has worked very hard to make sure that we don't have any. And they're very pleased that the Bush administration has been steadfast in avoiding any kind of mandatory greenhouse gas controls. They, by the way, played a really fairly decisive role in getting him elected. Of course, in the meantime, our emissions continue to rise, and so does the average temperature of the planet. 2002 was the second warmest year in history. The 1990s were the warmest decade probably in 1,000 years. We've got glaciers melting on nearly every continent. We've got the North Polar ice cap shrinking dramatically. We have chunks of ice the size of small nations breaking off of the ice shelves of Antarctica. All of this and the even more frightening projections for the future have persuaded the rest of the developed world to go forward without us on the Kyoto Protocol. it's probable that this summer that is going to go into effect, and these other nations, which are already generally much more fuel efficient than we are going to be taking even more steps away from a dependency on fossil fuel. America, by contrast, the largest greenhouse gas producer in the world, the source of some 25% of greenhouse gases, continues to burn ever more fossil fuel. So I honestly don't think this situation can last too much longer. I think if only because of the international pressure, we are going to have to be taking climate change seriously fairly soon. And that raises the question, what about coal? Does that mean the end of this long story of coal use on Earth? Now, if you ask the coal industry that, what they'll tell you is that not necessarily, and just in case we ever have to reduce greenhouse gases, not that we have to, but in case we ever decide later that we have to, they're working on a long-term plan to try to make coal more palatable. And the name of the approach is carbon sequestration. The idea is that they're going to try to collect the carbon dioxide that's spewing out of all the smokestacks and tuck it away somewhere in the earth. Now, this actually might be an acceptable idea if they were talking about it as a way of retrofitting existing coal plants so that you could then keep operating them until you were able to build a more kind of sustainable and clean system. But nobody's really imagined a way that you can retrofit the existing coal plants. What they're talking about instead is actually redesigning coal plants so the carbon dioxide stream is more concentrated, rebuilding all of our fleet of coal plants, now we're of course talking about some decades in the future, and building an infrastructure where you would collect that carbon dioxide, transport it, and dispose of it. Now, where do you put it? There's been talk about using abandoned oil wells, about using abandoned coal mines, but it seems quite likely that there are not going to be nearly enough of those kinds of geologic formations to hold the spectacular quantities of carbon dioxide that we would be talking about. So they're also looking, and by they I mean the coal industry and the Department of Energy, at the deep oceans, at essentially pumping carbon dioxide down there, at essentially carbonating. This obviously is something that has the potential for tremendous environmental consequences, and people who know about the plan tend to be pretty worried about it. Ultimately, I don't think it will happen because, in fact, we do have better options in the realm of renewables like wind and solar, and if you combine them with a system of hydrogen production, which allows you then to store and distribute energy, you could actually have a system, you could finally have a system that is truly clean and truly renewable. And I think that's the way we're more likely to go, though perhaps because I'm an optimist by nature. Which brings me to my last excerpt. In imagining possible futures, it's important to factor in one last critical energy source: excitement. There was a time when coal was actually fun. Not the mining, which was never fun, but the building of a powerful, new, coal-fired world, which inspired distinct bursts of imagination, enthusiasm, and daring at various historical moments. Matthew Boulton's excitement over his partner James Watt's steam engine came from his belief in it as the key to building a magnificent new society of unlimited possibilities. George Stephenson was surely thrilled to zoom across the English landscape. Jacob Sist and his young crew shot the rapids of Pennsylvania's Lehigh River on flimsy arcs filled with coal, mainly for the glory and adventure of helping create a new industry to fuel a new world. Even Franklin B. Gowan, when he organized the anthracite cartel in the name of empowering a growing nation, was probably having an excellent time. Today, though, the thrill of coal is gone, and it's not likely to come back, even if technological breakthroughs can reduce its environmental impact. Bright, ambitious people eager to change the world will be less inspired by the challenge of building a vast new carbon sequestration infrastructure, essentially a system of perpetual waste management, than by the challenge of building completely new energy industries with no waste at all. Enthusiasm and talent will flow more freely to the new energy industries, not to mention the backing of visionary financiers, and environmentally concerned investors. Most people would simply rather direct their passion and money toward creating a new world than toward retrofitting the old one, at least when the old one is as deeply flawed and widely unloved as your average coal plant. It is, in short, hard to imagine that we'll ever make the sweeping investments needed to make coal use truly sustainable, when we appear to have better and ultimately probably cheaper options, even among the technologies we already know about. But that still leaves open the question of when we will have the political will to abandon the investment we've already made in coal, and in places like the United States and China, the investments we continue to make. And with that, I guess I will take your questions. And if you could wait before you ask for the microphone to come so we can all hear you. Good question. We, by the way, have a coal plant not very far from here, the High Bridge plant. And if you look at it, especially during the summer, you can't see anything coming out of it. It's hard to even know when it's on. In the winter, you'll see big white plumes coming out. In fact, that's mostly smoke. And that plant is not particularly well controlled, is my understanding. So even there, you have a plant without scrubbers, and you still can't see the pollution. So we've managed in this country to keep most of that pollution invisible. And we've done that in part by keeping out the little visible particulates and whatnot. So we send out these vast streams of invisible pollution that then spread a very long way. In China, the smoke I saw coming out of the stacks was quite dark. It was gray or black. China has a tremendous pollution problem, a tremendous local pollution problem. 5 out of the 10 filthiest cities in the world are in China, Beijing being one of them. And the country is starting to deal with that problem, but only on a very local level. They haven't even gotten yet to the regional level. But I also want to say that a lot of plants in this country, in America, remain uncontrolled. And it's important to keep in mind that you can have a very polluting plant and have no visible emissions coming from it. That's actually the easier question. Yeah. Call them, write them, and vote accordingly and make sure it becomes an issue. I mean, the amazing thing was that in 2000, we never had a clearer choice between a president who had written a book about global warming and who had helped negotiate Kyoto, and between a president who had worked within the oil industry. And of course, it was not really an issue in the 2000 election, except in West Virginia, where the coal industry helped deliver the state to George Bush. And had they not, and in fact that's a traditionally Democratic state, had they not been so active in trying to prevent Gore from becoming president, I think Gore would have been president. As far as my optimism, I mean, the good thing is there are a lot of things going on. I mean, remember the 70s, and we had renewable energy coming up, and people didn't take it hugely seriously, and we made a lot of mistakes, but there have been people all along the way who are continuing to develop wind and solar. The industry in California sort of kept chugging along. More importantly, the industry in Europe kept going, and that technology is now really quite advanced, and it is, in fact, fairly inexpensive. You can get electricity from wind turbines in a windy place like southwestern Minnesota, and it doesn't cost that much more than what you would get from a coal plant. Now, the problem with things like wind and solar is that not just the cost, but reliability has been an issue because the wind isn't always blowing when you want electricity, and electricity, we really don't have a way of storing it. You need to generate it when you need it. And that's why the technology of hydrogen is considered so promising. Hydrogen is not an energy source, it is an energy carrier, but what it allows you to do is you can use the electricity that you are generating in these windy, distant places on windy days, create hydrogen, then you build an infrastructure to distribute it the way we have distribution of natural gas and petroleum right now. And then you can use that hydrogen for a fuel cell car, for a fuel cell in your home to meet your own electricity needs. So that's certainly a very promising technology. Now, many of you heard President Bush mentioning hydrogen at his recent State of the Union address. He was talking about it really as a replacement of foreign oil. But that is a sign of, I'll call it progress. I mean, Al Gore was raked over the coals for proposing pretty much exactly the same thing not very long ago. And it remains to be seen what kind of commitment we'll really get out of the White House, but at least it is now being talked about. People are starting to envision a post-fossil fuel world. And there are so many advantages to it, quite apart from climate change. Coal, as I mentioned, is putting pollution in the air that, according to recent studies, is killing tens of thousands of Americans, quite possibly thousands and quite possibly tens of thousands of Americans every year. Now, and you think about just the potential litigation involved in that, and that pollution is coming largely from these heavy coal-burning states in the Midwest, Ohio, River Valley type states. A lot of it is blowing east to places like New York and Massachusetts, places with Republican governors, but they're very angry about this, and they're promoting renewable energy within their own states as a result. So what I'm hoping is going to build the momentum is the fact that the costs are already coming down. Europe is already going ahead to continue developing the technology. Hopefully that will bring the costs down even further. And there are so many other reasons that relate very directly to our lifestyles and our health that I'm just very hopeful that the ball will start rolling. Well, that actually, you raise a very important question, and I don't know that I can answer it. I mean, at least as I hear you, to address those problems means installing lots of expensive control equipment on those plants, and that would save a lot of lives. And it's very, very hard to not want to do that. On the other hand, it is very, very expensive to do that, and so the question becomes, is it worth it to invest a lot in those sort of interim improvements in a technology that we're going to try to abandon, hopefully, fairly quickly? And I don't know that I can answer that. It's a question of how we're going to value our health, what sort of improvements we can get for a certain amount of money vis-a-vis what we could do if we actually closed down those plants. We could invest, by the way, not just in new energy technologies, but in efficiency improvements. Of course, we're very wasteful in our energy use, and you can get a lot of improvements by spending that same sort of money to actually reduce usage and close some of those plants. It's a hard question to answer, though, without a specific scenario in front of you and dollars and cents and lives and all those really hard things. My understanding is that there is, in fact, plenty of that kind of solar income coming in. And what's interesting, of course, is that coal represents a deviation from our dependency on solar income. We and every other species on the planet, if you don't count certain microorganisms that live in volcanoes and things, have depended on solar income since life began. And coal was this major threshold where all of a sudden we didn't just depend on what had just arrived or what was held in the tissues of the plants and other living things, but we went underground and we started using this fuel from hundreds of millions of years before. And that we could not have built the society that we have today had we not been able to do that. But it may well be now, with our technology or with our ability to harness those power sources, that coal, in essence, that fossil fuels have given us the ability to live based on solar income, so that, in fact, we don't need coal or someday even oil anymore. I am a sinner with everyone else. I am waiting for my local power company to offer me green power, and in fact that is something they're supposed to be offering soon, but they haven't offered it yet, and as soon as they do, then I'll certainly pay a premium to get that. In the meantime, try to keep the lights off when I don't need them. I'm not sure if it's from greenhouse gases, but there certainly is a correlation between asthma, especially in children, and ozone. And ozone, you've heard about the ozone layer. There's a problem in the stratosphere where we don't have enough ozone, but we have a problem down here where we have too much ozone, and ozone definitely triggers asthma attacks. And ozone comes not out of any smokestack, but it's a combination of pollutants, and one of the critical ingredients is nitrogen oxides, which come from coal, also from cars, but coal is a major contributor to that. So yes, there would be a very direct link between asthma, particularly childhood asthma, and emissions from a coal plant. I like your question about nuclear power and coal. We have been, of course, worried about nuclear power, and with good reason, for a long time. But I think in comparison, particularly to nuclear power, which is so modern and scary, coal just seems so old-fashioned and friendly, and how could coal be doing all this damage? It's unfortunate that we can't seem to worry about more than one thing at a time. The problem with the control technologies is that they will deal with the kind of pollutants that contribute to acid rain and that get in your lungs and can kill you, and ozone and mercury. But they don't deal with the greenhouse gases. And in fact, it's possible that you can even make the problem a little bit worse by making that plant slightly less efficient, so that there's more greenhouse gases per unit of, per kilowatt coming out of the plant. Now, one way that you can improve their climate performance is by improving efficiency. Coal gasification is one way to do that. Again, that gets back to the interim investment question. How much money do we want to build to make coal gasification plants when, in fact, we might spend that money on truly renewable sources? And I'm glad you raised the Middle East, because I know a lot of people are thinking about that. A lot of people are thinking about oil. And the last time we had a big oil crisis, people started talking about coal. And the idea was we were going to make liquid fuels out of coal. And that is possible, but we haven't done it. I think there's maybe one sort of experimental plant out there. Despite investments and tax incentives and whatnot, it just hasn't happened. So that means it's not likely, I think, to be a short-term solution, just because we don't have the infrastructure in place to give us a significant amount of liquid fuel. And I don't see it as a long-term solution, simply because it doesn't address climate change. And I think it's going to be unlikely that we're going to be pouring a lot of money into any energy technologies. Again, this is perhaps the optimist in me coming out, but to spend a lot of money building a new infrastructure that may solve your supply problem, but which doesn't solve your climate change problem, seems like a bad investment.